the second part of my tutorial series, we'll talk about how movement works into the strongest. I'll just show you range of motion using this one unit. So I can move any box around here that is open. We'll start with what you can do for an easy activation is I can just move my troops up front. That is called an easy activation, very simple maneuver. Or I can do a difficult activation in which I move diagonally. Or another difficult activation I could do would be to, of course, move diagonally the other way. I could also sidestep facing the same direction, either side. I could move backwards for a difficult activation. And I could even, as I'll show here, change the facing of my troops within my box. So I could face them to the right, to the left, back, and that too would be a difficult activation. Now there are a few caveats about changing facing within your box. If you have two units occupying the same box, they must be facing in the same direction. You can't have one unit facing to the side and another unit facing forward. So hopefully now you have an idea of what movements are available to you. Now we're just going to see it in action as I have Romans versus Germans. So when dealing with movement, we have to take into consideration what we learned in the last video. Just like before, we're going to choose one of our commands to activate first. I am going to choose to activate this left command once again. And just as before, I can choose any one of these four units in this command to move. All right. Kind of the basic movement runs along the lines of this. Infantry can move one box ahead, whereas cavalry can move two. Light infantry can only move one box ahead, just like infantry, but there is no such thing as a difficult activation for light troops. So they can get onto hills, they can turn easier, they can just get in and out of rough terrain. I'll also discuss marching, in which you are able to move troops one box further than normal. It's a good way to reinforce different parts of your army that might be in trouble, or a good way to get into combat quickly at the beginning of a battle. So here's just all my commands laid out. And just as before, I'll have two attached generals on each of my flanks with a detached general in the middle. I'm going to choose to activate this left command first. Alright, so I can go ahead now and choose any one of those units to activate. I'm going to activate these cavalry over here on the far left. In order to do so, I'll have to draw a 2 or better. 2 or better. So these guys again will be able to move 2 grid lengths ahead. Cavalry obviously are more mobile than infantry, so they have that movement advantage. Alright. Now if I wanted to, I could actually move them 3 boxes ahead. That's what we consider a marching order. You are able to march, which is travel 1 box further than usual, only if you have no enemies that are in a position to charge you, or you're entering into an enemy's zone of control. Also, you cannot march into a box that any enemy skirmishers are able to fire into. So basically, if the area is clear of enemies, you can march 1 box further. And again, that's usually relevant for forces that are behind your main line and can reinforce. And often, the player that's taking the role of the attacker, the player that gets to go first, often will march his troops up just to get into battle quicker. Alright, so that's kind of the basis of marching. You can extend your movement by 1. So cavalry can, if they choose, they can go move ahead 3 units, or infantry can go ahead and move 2. And you can also mix difficult activations with marching orders. So I could move a unit diagonally and then move them 1 more unit forward as long as there were no enemies around. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to activate this unit over here on the far left, this cavalry unit. I'll need a 2 or better to activate, like we've talked about before. So let's see what I draw. I draw a king. Now I am just going to move these guys 2 straight ahead, but I want to show you what options are available to me. Now if I wanted to do a difficult activation, I could move these units diagonally and then up 1. That would be considered a difficult activation. So in order for me to do that, I would have to draw a 3 or higher for my initial activation. And as long as I did that, I could move them over diagonally, and then I could move them up one more. All right. Again, as long as I was able to do just a slightly more difficult activation. Now I could also, if I wanted to, move them sideways. All right, and then up one. You know, you have a lot of possibilities of movement, especially when you're dealing with cavalry. But I'm just going to keep it simple, and we're just going to do a easy activation, move them straight ahead. Now I'm going to go ahead and activate another unit within my command. I'll activate the unit that has the attached general. So if I do draw an ace, I will be able to replay that card. So I'm going to move that unit and its accompanying unit together. I have to draw a 2 or better. I draw a 5. So normally I would be able to move these infantry, these foot units, 1 grid length ahead. But since I have no enemies directly in front of them, no one that can shoot at them, charge them, I'm not going into anyone's zone of control, I am able to move them up 2 spaces. So they're right there now next to my cavalry. And before I try and activate them again, I'm going to go to my final unit in my lefternmost command. Now, I could move these guys diagonally or behind, as I said, but it makes most sense, of course, for me just to do an easy activation and move straight ahead. So just as before, I will activate this unit on a 2 or higher. So I go ahead and I draw a 7, which means I will be able to move them, activate them. I will go ahead and march them up 2 grid spaces. Alright, and after I do that, I will go and I'll attempt to activate another one of my units for the second time. I'm going to activate the unit in the middle because, as you can see, they have the lowest value on their first activation of 5. So to activate them again, I will need to draw a 6 or higher in order to activate. Alright, I draw a 9, and so I am able to activate them one more time. Now I can't march them 2 spaces in this instance because I have an enemy straight ahead of me that would be able to charge me, would be able to fire at me had I done that. So I may only move these guys, and so I was only able to move them 1 grid, and with that I will end this command's turn and move on to the center. So here in my central command, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to move my general first. Again, it's the smart way of doing things. In case you draw an ace, you can replay it. So I'll be able to activate them with a 3 or higher because I want to march them on top of that hill in front of me. And that is, of course, a difficult activation. So in order for me to move them, I'd have to draw a 1 higher card than normal to get them onto that hill. They usually activate on a 2. So to get them up on top of that hill, they will need to draw a 3. Alright? And again, difficult activations are anytime you're moving in and out of terrain, anything difficult. So I draw a 10, and so I am able to get them onto the hill. And it's not the best activation because that pretty much ensures that I will only get to move them once. So now I'm going to activate these skirmishers in the middle here. Now, normally you can activate units sharing the same box at the same time and move them. But since skirmishers have this nice little ability where they ignore difficult activations, I'm going to move them separate from the infantry. So unlike other infantry, which would take a 3 to get them on the hill, I can just get them up there with a 2. I draw a 9, so obviously they make it up there no problem. Now I'm going to activate the troops that were sharing a box with them, and since they are not light infantry, they're regular infantry, they'll need a 3 or better to get up on the hill and join their skirmisher buddies. They draw an ace, and so the command's turn is over. So I'm going to skip my Roman's last command. I think you get how the activation process works. So I'm going to pretend like the Roman turn is over. Now it's the Germans' turn. And I'm just going to activate one of their commands to show you the differences between the Romans versus these units that have deep units and how it's kind of harder for them to move and maneuver. So I'm going to go ahead and activate this central command right here where you see the general there. He is a detached general, so he can move around, do a command move if any of my units fail to activate, and help them maybe retry that activation. Alright, so we're going to go and I'll show you how their movements are a little bit different than the Romans. These units are considered deep units. They're units comprised of a lot of men, and also since they're not as trained as the Romans, they do not move or activate as easily. For the Romans, whenever they had a difficult activation, they just had to draw a one higher activation than they previously would have needed otherwise. So if you had activated on a 3, you would actually need a 5 to activate for Romans. For these guys, every difficult activation is considered a double difficult activation. So you'd have to add 2 to that number in order to activate. So if I activated on a 3 and I wanted to do a double difficult maneuver, I'd have to activate on a 6. So it's a little bit harder for them to do these difficult activations. But anyways, I'm going to activate this guy in the front. Now I can only actually move him one grid space, as long as I got a 2 or higher. I cannot march him because I'd be marching him into the zone of control of an enemy unit. Alright, you can only do march moves if you do not have an enemy in a position to charge you at the end of your march. If I would have charged onto that hill, that Roman would have been in a position to attack me, so I may only move 1. Alright, 1 space. Now, if I do want to move up onto that hill, I'll have to activate that unit again, and it will be, as I will call it, a double difficult activation. But for right now, I'm going to go ahead and move to another unit in that command, this light infantry unit, this skirmisher. He has to activate on a 2 or better. I activate him on a 4. Now skirmishers are cool because there's no such thing as a difficult activation. So in order to get him up on that hill, I would just have to draw a 5 or better. Alright, so they are easy to do hard maneuvers. But as I said, I always like to activate every unit in my command at least once before I activate them again. So I'm going to activate this unit, need a 2 or better. I get a 2 and I move them 1 box. Now I will activate the last unit in my command. I activate him with an 8, or with the 6, sorry, and I'll just move him behind. I can't move him ahead to share a box. 2 warbands deep units can't share the same grid, so I'll have to stop right there. So I'll activate that front unit again. It's going to be a double difficult maneuver. Alright, so I would normally need a 6 in order to activate, but since it's a double difficult maneuver, I will need an 8 in order to get that unit on top of the hill. Alright, so you can see, for deep units, doing these complex maneuvers is quite risky. And if I don't draw an 8, that means my turn is over and the command is done. So instead, I've rethought my original idea and decided, you know what, I'm going to go and I'm going to activate this unit over here that activated on a 2. Alright, makes sense. In order to get them on the hill, I will have to move through my light skirmishers in front of me. You can move through light units, they're the only units you can do that with. And I will need a 5 or better to get up onto that hill. Alright, it's a double difficult activation, so I would normally need a 3 or better, but then I have to add 2 to that value, so a 5. So you see how a 5 is less risky to get up on that hill than an 8 with the other unit. So I'm going to elect to activate them first. So let's see what I draw. Look at that, I draw a 5. That's exactly what I needed to activate, so I'm able to get my units on the hill. They do the double difficult activation without a problem. But you can see if you're playing a unit or a faction that relies on deep units, you have to think out the risk and reward of doing these difficult maneuvers. So hopefully you now have an idea of how movement works, just a basic idea of how the units move around the battlefield. And I think that movement does a great job, just like all aspects of this rule system, of making you balance risk versus reward. Do you want to push a unit a little bit farther and risk maybe having your command fail to activate and have your commands turn over? Really, if you don't plan out your activations in an intelligent manner, you can find your army just stopped in its tracks. And so next time we will talk about the combat mechanics of To the Strongest, and after that video you'll probably have a clearer understanding of how the rule system fits together with the combat and movement together. And so I will see you next time.